All right. Thank you all for joining us tonight for the 𝐷𝐿𝐿 County Vulnerability Assessment second public meeting. Obviously, we're very excited to be presenting to you all the results of the analysis that this assessment team has been conducting for the past number of months since we were here last summer. So we're looking forward to presenting the results and having a dialogue today. So we'll start with just an introduction of our team who's been working on this. We'll provide an overview of the project for those who may have forgotten from the last summer to now. I know I forget sometimes where we're going with this, so it's good to have that little refresher. We'll talk about what data we collected, what the assets we looked at are, the different categories and types. We'll talk about the results of our analyses. What did we find out? What did we learn? Where are the vulnerabilities located? What parcels are exposed to flooding? Where do we see vulnerable assets? And then we'll talk about, now that we have all of this information, what we're going to do next. We have a small group here tonight, so I do ask that, if you have a question, feel free to speak up. Feel free to interrupt me. I prefer that we have a dialogue than for us to just talk at you all for an hour. That's not quite as enjoyable. So if you have questions, please feel free to speak up at any point. And our team tonight, starting with Tanya Gallagher, our project manager. On the 𝐷𝐿𝐿 side, my name is 𝐷𝐿𝐿. I'm the deputy project manager. Our colleague Blaine Beck, who's a project engineer, and Chris Lambert, our geospatial specialist. And I would ask if folks here are okay with going around the room and just introducing yourselves real quick.
Brian Prince, 𝐷𝐿𝐿 County Emergency Management.
Mike Hackett, 𝐷𝐿𝐿 County Water and Sewer Director.
April Sutton, Mayor Pro Tem, City of Fairhaven.
Mike Robert, Coastal Resource Manager.
Dave Watkins, Citizen.
Sherry Cadenhead, planning coordinator.
Thank you all. We're excited to have you all here tonight. We appreciate you taking the time out of your busy schedules to join us. So before we go any further, we're going to talk a little bit about, provide an overview of this project. What is vulnerability assessment and what are we trying to accomplish? So vulnerability assessments are something that we do as part of, are projects that are funded by the Resilient Florida Grant Program. This is a state-funded program that really looks at vulnerable infrastructure, both inland and along the coast, and it helps us identify where there are vulnerabilities to flooding and sea level rise. So vulnerability assessment can do some things, and it does not do other things, right? So it is not intended as an individual or property level assessment of flood risk, right? We're really looking at community flooding, right? And the effects on community owned assets. It's not supposed to support property level improvements, but it can support capital projects. It can also support can provide some support for stormwater engineering projects. However, it does not align with what we call in the industry hydrology and hydraulics, or H&H models, those sorts of flood models. This is not quite as detailed as those. Right? We're very much looking at that larger county scale at this time. What the vulnerability assessment does do is, first and most importantly, it makes the county eligible for future funding through the Resilient Florida Grant Program by having this assessment that is in alignment with the state requirements. The county is going to be eligible for Resilient Florida Grant Program funds for projects that support reducing flood vulnerability. It helps identify where are priority areas for adaptation, right? What areas may need some sort of projects to really reduce the risk associated with flooding. It helps us link to other policies and strategies throughout the county and really operationalize resilience. Resilience does not exist within a singular entity, right? It doesn't exist just within the water and sewer department, right? Or in the transportation group. It exists throughout the county, so to operationalize it is something we're able to support through this project. Right? It can help us understand what lands might need to be acquired, right? Where are there repetitive flood loss properties? Where are there areas with high flood risk that maybe those lands need to be bought out so as to further support community resilience and to prevent flooding? And this can help support policy recommendations, right? Maybe, for example, modifying a flood ordinance. So there's a lot of things that the vulnerability assessment project can support. So here's a brief overview of our timeline. We kicked this off back in April of 2024, and it is now February 2025, which is kind of crazy to think about. We're having our second public meeting. We have begun the process of identifying our adaptation focus areas, right? Where do we want to really look at for adaptation specific areas with hotspots of vulnerability? We're also in the process of finalizing the vulnerability assessment report, which will be submitted to the county. The county will be submitting to the state in order to get the go-ahead, make sure it's in alignment, with all of the state requirements. And then from there, we'll begin developing the adaptation plan. Right? It'll take all of these vulnerabilities we have identified, and as we say, it's the fun part, we start thinking about solutions and how we can mitigate those risks. I won't go too deeply into this, but this is just a brief overview of our project methodology. And so we've gone through a whole process here. We started by identifying our goals and looking at our data, figuring out what hazard scenarios we wanted to look at, particularly in the present day, and for 2040 and 2070, the associated flood scenarios. We mapped those hazards using geospatial tools. We looked at where that flooding occurs, right? What is that exposure? What are the flood depths at all of these different assets? It's all part of our vulnerability assessment. How does that translate to a risk level? And then from there, we're sort of in that piece right here between risk analysis and mitigation strategy. Now that we've done that, we're going to solicit feedback tonight, finalize our results, and then we'll begin developing those mitigation strategies. Right? We'll evaluate and rank different adaptation projects, and we'll have a roadmap for implementation. Right? How does this adaptation work get done to make the county more resilient? So as part of this project, we embarked on a robust data collection process that really began with our first public meeting at the end of July 2024. We had a number of participants from throughout the county. We had a lot of input from folks on where they're seeing flooding in their communities, what they would like to see analyzed. And then in addition, as part of that, we were acquiring a lot of background data and quantitative data from a number of different sources, including the state of Florida, the Florida Division of Emergency Management, various communities as well. We looked at a number of critical assets. There are 4 different critical asset categories through the state that are required to be analyzed in this assessment. So transportation and evacuation routes, critical infrastructure, critical community and emergency facilities, hospitals, fire stations, natural, cultural, and historical resources, like historical buildings, shorelines, parks, and so forth. We had about 127,000 assets within that. And an asset could be a single point that is the location of a fire station. It could be a segment of a roadway. Right? A lot of different pieces of data came in from a lot of different sources. And we're very grateful to everybody who provided this information. And so now that we have all this data, we're able to go ahead and conduct our exposure analysis. And for that, we really want to know in our exposure analysis, we want to see where is the flooding occurring and how deep is that flooding working. So as part of this analysis, we decided upon looking at 2 flood hazards. The first is the one commonly known as that 100-year flood. You may hear this every now and again. It's important to note that the 100-year flood is a little bit of a misnomer. It's not actually a flood that's going to occur once every 100 years, but it is the 1% annual exceedance probability flood, which is not quite as catchy, which is why people call it the 100-year flood. But it's the flood that has 1% chance to occur every year. So just know that when we say 100-year flood, and we'll say it just for ease of conversation, we're really talking about that 1% likelihood to flood. Right? It's a good baseline, it's a good benchmark for understanding where an area is going to flood. The 100-year event is also used a lot in those federal flood maps developed by FEMA. Right? It incorporates a number of different sources, so it looks at rainfall flooding, riverine flooding, and coastal flooding. Puts it all together. We saw that there were a range of depths for these flood events from 1 to 4 feet, depending on location throughout the county. We also looked at tidal flooding. And tidal flooding was defined as what we call the highest tide, that mean high water, plus 2 feet. Right? That's really that king tide event that's a little more rare. Those had depths ranging typically from 1 to 3 feet. And so looking at those give us a pretty good understanding of where we're going to see flooding hotspots. And one thing to note as well is that our 100-year flood event also is approximately equivalent to a Category 2, Category 3 hurricane. So this is something that also, when we're looking at this, we're really looking at, okay, how is Category 2 storm surge going to affect the county as well? So this is a countywide level here, or a countywide view, excuse me, of that 100-year flood event. And we're going to dive in a little deeper, starting in the North County. Right, so we can see that primarily, we're in the North County, all that flooding is coming from rainfall and from rivers. So obviously, we're not going to see any storm surge impacts in there. And really, the impacts we're beginning to see are in some of the communities, right? We're seeing a little bit of flooding in Crestview and along some of our critical roadways. We'll dive a little deeper into that later. In Central County, right? Central County is primarily taken up by Eglin Air Force Base, so there's a fair bit of flooding along a lot of those tributaries throughout the base, as well as along the Shoal River. And in South County, we see flooding, on the southern portions of communities of Niceville, of Valparaiso, and then a fair amount of it in Fort Walton Beach and Mariester. For our 100-year flood exposure, that 1% likelihood of flooding, we looked at how that's going to change in the present day versus the future 2040 and 2070s, right? Adding on that anticipated sea level rise on a mountain. And what our results are telling us here is that really less than 10% of the assets that we analyze throughout the county are going to be exposed, right? Less than 10% of those assets will be exposed to flooding, right? They'll have some level of flood depth. It looks like a lot, right? 11,000, however many, 11,032 assets in the present day is a lot. It's important to note that some of these are roadway segments, so it might be different constituent pieces of the whole road. So if we say, for example, Highway 85 is vulnerable to flooding, it's not all of Highway 85, it's just select segments of that roadway. The fact that less than 10% of the assets are experiencing exposure is a good thing. That means that this is something that can be mitigated, right? There are projects that can be done to reduce this number further, reduce that vulnerability. One thing we looked at and that was noted during our initial public meeting was people want to understand, well, how are different communities and land uses affected by flooding, right? What types of lands are exposed to flooding and where? And so we went on a little bit of a journey to categorize different parcel types. And we came down to 8 different parcel types, right? Looking at where all these parcels located. So our land use categorizations that we developed for this project were, we looked at residential parcels, right? Single family homes, condominiums, and townhomes. Commercial parcels, right? Those can include restaurants and offices, retail spaces. Agricultural lands, right? That have cropland, pastures, and timberlands. Industrial areas, publicly owned parcels, conservation lands and natural areas, forests and parks and rivers and lakes. Institutional parcels, stuff owned, those are areas that are typically owned or utilized by colleges or churches, schools, right, different organizations. And then our military parcels, right, which as you can see take up quite a bit of the center of the county. And so in our figure here, right, we see that they're primarily, in the South County, it's quite a mix of land use, primarily residential and commercial lands. And then Mid-Central County, primarily military with Eglin and Hurlburt. And then in North County, it's far more agricultural and a little bit of some public lands as well. This is probably not news to any of you all who live here and know this. But it just helps us, seeing these colors on this map helps tell the story as we go forward, because we start to look at, as we dive a little deeper, we start to see what parcels are affected, right? In North County, we're really seeing that with some of that riverine flooding, right? It's primarily agricultural lands that are going to be experiencing this flooding. And this is a challenge, right? Because when we have these flood events, they can be pulling off lots of nutrients off of these agricultural lands into the water bodies, which can cause water quality issues, both within that stream and downstream, right? And also that flooding can ruin livelihoods. So something we may need to look at, right, is how do we protect the agricultural, or work with the agricultural land users to protect their lands out there. And there's also a little bit of military lands on the just that northern tip of Eglin that experience some flooding. And then there are some public lands as well. It's primarily what we're seeing in North County. Central County, we don't have a slide for just because it's all Eglin Air Force Base. And then in South County, we're really seeing it's a lot of residential land uses that are affected by that 100-year, that 1% likelihood flood event. Right? Lots of residential lands as well as some commercial land uses, some public areas as well. It's always important that we identify who owns what, because when we move into adaptation, it's really important to understand who do we need to talk to get a project done. As for tidal flooding, we have a number of, tidal flooding is obviously concentrated in South County. So we're really saying that they're the land use type that's primarily affected are residential lands. About approximately 6,400 residential lands, or residential parcels, are affected by tidal flooding. In the 2040, when we add our tidal flooding to that intermediate high sea level rise scenario, we start to see that increases significantly. And about 13,000 residential parcels experience some degree of flooding under that tidal flood event. And then we see a similar thing with our, we see a little more flooding with our 2070 intermediate high scenario. And so this is just a whole list of percentages of, whole list of which parcels are inundated and what, within each flood scenario. And so what we're seeing here is, overall, we see the most flooding with our conservation and natural land areas, which makes sense because those are typically right on the water. And then we also see some pretty significant inundation of some of our agricultural lands. Approximately 26% of them are inundated under that 100-year flood event. A number of public lands are inundated as well, and then a fair amount of residential parcels experience inundation as well, particularly in those coastal areas. Right? When you have that coastal surge, it's just going to affect a lot of folks in the southern areas of the county. So a little deeper dive into a couple of spots. First, on US 98, we're at Miracle Strip Parkway on Okaloosa Island. We can see here that as time goes on, more and more of the island is going to be inundated by these tidal flood events. And so, why is that important? Excuse me. So we're seeing that flood impact, pardon me folks. And so what's happening, we're going to see really the Miracle Strip Parkway is going to have pretty significant washout or flooding, which can inhibit evacuation. Right, there is already an ongoing living shoreline project in part of that area, but we're going to recommend that that we also need a broader strategy for the island for the island at large, and to protect Highway 98, and how we protect some of those businesses and assets there as well. And then for looking at 100-year flooding for the parcels near State Road 85 at the Shoal River. SR 85 is the major evacuation route, and the interchange is heading north out of the county. With that 100-year flood event, it has the potential to prevent people from taking 85 to exit, and so we need to look at that as well. That's something we've identified previously as part of the Military Installation Resilience Review. This is something that AFDOT is aware of, the county is aware of, and projects are actively planned to elevate that roadway. So we understand where the flooding is happening. Now we want to understand, how do we define the vulnerability of an asset? What criteria are we going to use? And so we developed a fun little table here that really helps us understand that. So we developed a couple of different classes of vulnerability, starting from no exposure to low to extreme. And so we developed these based off of a couple of different things, including FEMA substantial damage, looking at how the state developed their vulnerability assessment on the statewide level. And so this helps us understand, again, based off the associated depth of flooding, what's that risk level going to be for that asset? And so overall, right, as flood depths increase, we'll see a higher level of risk. We're not going to go through the results for each asset category, but instead we are going to just walk through our preliminary findings. So,
Thank you so much, Alec. Hi everyone, I'm Blake. So I'll be talking about the preliminary findings. So when we're talking about these assets we want to be thinking about what Alec mentioned about like the flood exposure, thinking about how deep the flooding is occurring at the asset. So the most vulnerable critical community and emergency facilities was found to be the Elliott Point Elementary School and the fire station out on Okaloosa Island. So the fire station shouldn't come as a surprise, it's out on the island. The island shuts down when there's a hurricane coming, so it isn't a shock that that asset was found to be highly vulnerable. The elementary school, I think because of the proximity to some of the bayou areas that we're seeing not only the 100-year flooding, but also tidal and storm surge flooding. So that's why we saw this asset rise to the top as one of the most vulnerable. So there are other assets in different categories that I'll be talking about that were found to be vulnerable. This category being the critical infrastructure. So Gap Creek, that lift station 562 that Okaloosa Water and Sewer maintains, and then some electrical infrastructure that FP&L maintains out on the island. Those were found to be the most vulnerable, again, because of their low-lying nature and where they're located near bodies of water. That's why we saw some flood exposure happening at these locations and a lot of flooding, to say the least. We have some other assets noted on here, the Shalimar Post Office, some more water and sewer infrastructure out on the island. The Lower Memorial Lake Dam was noted. I'm going to go into more detail on these assets on future slides. So we'll talk about wastewater utility infrastructure. So I know, get your glasses out because I'm having trouble reading this one too. But there were a number of lift stations. Lift stations are typically found to be in low-lying areas. And in this case, the lift stations that were at the south end of the county kind of dominated the show, if you will. They're low-lying, they're by those bodies of water. Storm surge is frequent in these areas. So this is mainly in Okaloosa's water and sewers district, and also Mary Esther had a few lift stations that popped up as highly vulnerable. Those lift stations on the south side of 98 and Mary Esther were getting some flood exposure. For water utility sensitivity, so it's really the 2 tanks that are out on the island that Okaloosa Water and Sewer maintains, and then also a standpipe that's owned by a private communications company over there and south of here, the Shalimar area. For stormwater treatment or stormwater infrastructure, the Lower Memorial Lake Dam over there by the Eglin Air Force Base, that one was really the only asset that came out as highly vulnerable for stormwater. For transportation and evacuation routes, so for this map that we're looking at here, this is for the thoroughfare roadways that were most vulnerable. We're looking at the south end of the county. I think there's some contrast issues with the projector, but you can see the blue highlighted areas are those roadways in the south end of the county that were highly vulnerable. So we're looking, south of 98 in the Windhaven area. We've got some areas around 85 and Racetrack in that area before you get over into Shalimar, and then some areas over in the Blue Water Bay area also were coming back as vulnerable. Out on Destin also some low spots there, but they're kind of in clusters. So over there by the Mid-Bay Bridge comes across, and then south side of, I guess, south of the main harbor area in Destin, there were some roadways over there that came as vulnerable. Okay, so now we're going to talk about these evacuation routes. So looking towards the north end of the county here in Crestview, so everybody knows about the 85 crossing a Shoal River, back in those events where there were flooding and 85 was shut down. So of course it was exposed. Highway 90 crossing at the Yellow River, and on the Shoal River side, and I-10 crossing the Yellow and Shoal River areas. County Road 393 over there, don't forget about that one, hiding on the far right side. That one does cross some tributaries of the Shoal River and was shown as vulnerable. and then 189 State Route 4. I think 189 was fine except closer to the Shoal River area, or excuse me, Yellow River area, and then towards the north end of the county. I think it crosses. We can talk about that in a future slide. Yeah, so this is moving further north here. So again, when you get further north, there's not that many creek crossings, so there wasn't that much exposure. State Route 4 crossing, I believe that's the Blackwater River.
Yes.
Okay. But yeah, as you go further north away from Crestview, there's less crossings, so there's not as many sections of the roadway that we would expect to see flooding. But the take-home point is in the north end of the county, it's really in the Crestview area that we have some issues that we're seeing some roadways seeing flooding. Does that seem consistent with what you all have seen, or is there any roadways, crossings that you have seen flooding that we're not picking up here?
Well, you don't have the county road Highway 2 so located. It runs from 189 to 85.
Okay,
The bridge is not flooded, but the entrance to the bridge from the 85 side has.
gotcha, okay. And so is County Road 2 a evacuation route or kind of a bypass route?
It is to an extent to be able to get from one point to the other.
Okay,
You're either going 189 north or 85,
right.
and 393 is 85, so.
So when, I guess I want to ask to follow up, like when, I guess Hurricane Opal probably would have been the last, major evacuation. Was there any evacuation challenges, or did everyone go east to Tallahassee like I did?
I don't think there was some up 85 till you got to Crestview. It was atrocious. But from there, they either were able to cross Yellow River and travel north on 189, or they went on 85 up to Florella.
Gotcha, okay, either way, okay. Is there any other areas for, major roadways that you've seen flooding, or that, besides County Road 2? All right, we'll move on. We already mentioned this one, talking about County Highway 393. So looking at this map, we're seeing some flooding occurring at that tributary for Shoal River and northward. Are there any other areas on 393 outside of this that we're seeing?
No.
Okay. Okay, so the south end of the county, so where all the fun stuff happens in a hurricane. So 98 on the island, shocking. We see that it's inundated. Parts of 98 as you get back on the mainland and in the Fort Walton Beach area in Mariester, we're seeing some flooding occurring there. 85 becomes problematic around the Cinco Bayou and crossing over into Shalimar. I believe in the middle of the county there's some other issues with 85 that we'll talk about. But besides, again, thinking like evacuation routes, do these routes shown here capture the typical route that people would take, or are we missing one? Because does Lewis Turner need to be included on here, or not really many people take Lewis Turner because it's on the outskirts of town?
No, Lewis Turner's represented there.
Oh, it is, okay.
Yeah, it's the 189.
Mid-Bay Bridge is,
Yeah, it's further east.
Okay. But I guess for the Fort Walton Beach
Oh.
area, do we capture all the routes?
I think so, as far as the
Okay.
major ins and outs.
Got it, okay. Okay, moving on to talking about, the vulnerable natural, cultural, and historic resources. So for shorelines, so what this map is showing is, these are shorelines that are going to be the most impacted by storm surge or storm events. And we're going to dive more into the evaluation of the shorelines when we get into the adaptation planning. But this is just to give you an idea of shorelines that would be most impacted.
Which is Colorado.
Yeah, it is, but there's some spots in there that, but yeah,
Well, and you've got some of those, south of Wind Haven and Mary Esther through there that are on Eglin Air Force Base.
right.
There is no fixing it at that point.
Right, absolutely.
I'm sure you got some dunes in those blank spots, pretty dunes.
Yeah.
One thing that our shoreline data set does. One thing that our shoreline data set does account for is, the type of shoreline, whether it is a hard, what we call hard infrastructure, a seawall, man-made shoreline, or a natural shoreline, right? Maybe it's in grass or a living shoreline, right? That's been worked on by the estuary program. And so what we'll do as part of our next steps is we're gonna actually look at those shoreline types, because our methodology doesn't go too deep into how you assess, right, any single asset type. So we're gonna look at what are these different shoreline types, right? If it's a hardened shoreline, such as a seawall, and this says there's, sea level rise is an issue there, well, maybe, we have to just do a second look and make sure, okay, is this actually going to be an issue at this spot? Maybe it's not. And so as we look at those shoreline types, we'll talk with some of the owners, we'll talk with Mike, and we'll really drill down into where those areas of vulnerability are. Because again, we are at that wide county level, and it's just a snapshot. And also, one thing to note is that some of these shoreline owners may be private owners, right? They may not, we can't necessarily go ahead and tell them what to do. And so as we talk about adaptation planning, some of it's going to be outreach and education, right? How do we work with people to make sure that, for example, seawalls are a consistent height? Because if my seawall is 5 feet high and Blaine's is 4 feet high, well, Blaine is still gonna flood, and some of that flooding may get onto my property, right? So how do we work together with our neighbors to have consistent protection? And so that's a little bit more of what we'll see on that shoreline piece in the adaptation piece.
I have a question. Did y'all take into consideration the shipping lanes that run through that? Because it's great when we all flood, but also when that sand fills in our shipping lanes, that can shut down a lot more stuff.
That's a really great question, and actually, we haven't looked at that at all. But that is something I think we can talk about a little more in adaptation plan, or excuse me, in the adaptation process. And so if there's data out there, April, we can talk a little more, where that might be, we can incorporate it into adaptation.
Thank you, Rob. All right, we'll move on to talking about, parks for the part of the vulnerable natural, cultural, and historic resources. So, the theme here is these parks that are in the low-lying areas, around the Bay Area. So the Florida Park, the Pocahontas Boat Ramp, Okaloosa Island Beach, front access. So again, the theme here are those parks that are located near bayous or on the beach in this case that are going to flood during storms. So that's why these rose to the top. So for the most vulnerable county municipal-owned vertical assets, so these are the assets like parks, again that rose to the top, the Gap Creek lift station. So these are assets that are county-owned or municipal-owned that were viewed or found to be the most vulnerable. Again, the theme here is those low-lying assets that are near the Bay areas or out on the island, and we're seeing a lot of this exposure of flooding during these storm events. All right, and
Now those parks, did you essentially, the Gulf side parks, all beach access, did you lump that into just beachfront?
yeah, so what could have, to talk about, why every single beachfront access didn't appear equal is because of maybe where the point asset was dropped, where it's located, and maybe the tidal depth was deeper at the beach access number 4, whereas the other ones it was further inland. So that's where you can see some issues with elevation playing into that.
Thank you. So before we talk a little bit about what comes next, I want to talk about what we didn't actually talk about. I'll explain further because that statement didn't make a whole lot of sense. Right, we talked a lot about there were a number of lift stations that were vulnerable. There were some roadways. We have areas right on bridge approaches and a number of areas throughout the county. A fair amount of parcel vulnerability. But what we didn't see a lot of, right, were fire stations, or, a lot of fire stations and police stations were not vulnerable. We did have one that was highly vulnerable, but a lot of them didn't display that much flood vulnerability, right? The Emergency Operations Center for the county displayed minimal vulnerability. The 𝐅𝐥𝐸 water treatment plant, or wastewater plant, has no vulnerability to flood hazards. So one thing that's a very good finding from our assessment is that there is a lot of critical infrastructure that supports daily life that displays low or no vulnerability to flood. And so when we talk about this and we look at all this information, look at these maps of flooding, I ask that you not despair, that we not immediately think, oh no, this is terrible. Because what we've really found is, yes, there are a number of assets, there are some roadways that need some work, but it's very doable and it's very achievable. And so that's what we're going to go, as we go into the adaptation process, that's something that we're going to work on, right? How do we make the county more resilient so people can continue to live, happily, healthily, and safely here? So what our next steps immediately, we invite folks to look at our blank screen. Well, but we have some discussion questions. There we go. We have some discussion questions for you all. If there's something, actually, we have some questions we'd like to run through with the group and see if get any feedback. For those for our friends who may be watching us right now, live or recorded, you can also see we have it on the slides here. If you can get if you can take a picture of that. But some questions, right, that we just want to ask the group. Starting with, and some of these again we're rehashing, but we do want to just ask in case there are folks here who weren't here the first time. Have you experienced any flooding in your neighborhood? And if so, what were those contributing factors, right? Did it come from storm surge during a hurricane? Was it after a severe rainstorm or one of those rain bombs? Right? Was it just on a sunny day and it was a tidal flooding event? If anyone would like to, anyone has anything?
Yes.
Yes, ma'am.
Anytime it rains, 98, all throughout the sections, it doesn't have to be even a significant rainfall, floods. In front of Fort Walton Beach's City Hall is always fun if you're a low-lying car. 98 in particular is probably the worst. And due to that, a lot of people try and stay out of that right lane because that's where it slopes off, but it doesn't seem like anybody coordinates with each other from FDOT, cities, counties. I'm trying to be nice. Highway 98 was just resurfaced and in bigger valleys into entrances to neighbors and neighborhoods and businesses all along Highway 98. So now there's new puddles to go through, which are a lot of fun if you're a low-lying car. We've got county roads that always flood, like Page-Bacon over by the mall. That road floods, and then people will drive on the opposite lane to avoid the deep puddles, which creates issues in itself. And we have a lot of pedestrian and bicyclists in our communities, whether it's their only mode of transportation. And so when the roads are flooded and people go by, that creates safety hazards for them as well. And I don't think we do a very good job in covering those bases and really communicating with city, county, and FDOT levels. Like, we don't seem to all get in the same room to come up with solutions. We seem to independently do something and then later tear it out and redo it.
Okay. So just to repeat what I've heard from you, April, make sure we captured it correctly. Highway 98 throughout its entirety is critical. There are a lot of flooding hotspots. The resurfacing has, sort of exacerbated some of those flooding issues. It's not just for the vehicles, it's also for multimodal folks, so folks who are walking, who are biking. So maybe one thing we need to do, Tanya and Ryan, as part of our adaptation plan is just talk, and Tanya, you and I talked about that a little bit about this before, is get everybody in the room for Highway 98. We had talked about it in the Military Installation Resilience Review, and that was really the focus on congestion. But we need to talk a little more about it with a holistic flooding focus, because there's a fair amount of, there are a lot of different stakeholders who need to get
You drive during the sunshine, but when it rains,
Right.
it really backs up.
Right.
And it creates an undue safety for everything.
Absolutely.
From military readiness to our citizens being able to get to work. And our kids are on school buses during all this as well. And we do see a lot more accidents. And then, like I said, we have a lot more pedestrians and bicycles on the road than we've ever had, so.
So that'll be a point of focus for us for adaptation. That's something we've already talked about, but thank you, April, this helps confirm. Any other notes on flooding in your communities?
I got one for you.
Yes, sir.
He's not here, but I'll speak on his behalf. April knows I was over there. His name is Walt Boyd. I'm gonna give you his address. His name is Walt Boyd. And he bought a house, on the map it showed, Boyd, excuse me, B-O-Z-E. He's in the military, he bought a house that got fixed up. It had apparently flooded before, somebody bought it and flipped it. And then you got filling bills all the way around it, no drainage system on the road. And it's out by the work, it's south of 98, Harper Road, 307 Harper Road. I sent him in about this, and surprised he didn't show up. I'm Chris Kerr with Flood Defense, by the way, in Panhandle. I wanted to know if that map included that area of 98, because the houses next to it don't flood because they got built up, they were filling bills. It's right there on the west.
It's a little further to the west,
Okay.
on the other side of Herbert Field.
Okay, so may not quite be included in this figure. I think it is, Chris, but we can take a second look and get back to
Yeah, we
you.
can do it offline, it ain't a big deal.
Sure.
Well, it is a big deal,
Yeah,
but.
and it is to Walton, sure, 307 Tarpon Road, yes?
Yes, sir.
Is that the point where it comes, there's
No.
that point on the side?
I have to.
Not that far, okay.
Thanks, sir.
Thank you.
I have a few other things to say once you.
Certainly. Are there any questions that folks have that are, maybe I don't want to go over time here. Are there any questions that folks might have or that you noted, right, in the sheets that you may want to discuss? Yes, sir.
Starting from, this is, don't have a lot of knowledge, so one of my questions is, on these events, how quickly do you expect waters to mitigate or recede? Because as somebody in a residence, I don't mind staying in place but then I start worrying about things like, okay, my water and electrical utilities, is there a chance they might be restored quickly? And then how quickly would the waters recede and things start returning to somewhat normal? So is that a factor in all of this?
It's a good question. Yeah, it's a great question, Wayne. And so the modeling here doesn't take into account the recession of waters. Those are going to be very much dependent upon the event and the timing of it. If the tides are higher and you have a rainstorm, it may take a little longer, right, if that water system is backed up, as then if they were lower. I can't speak to recession or restoration of services. That's not my place, Ryan. I don't know if you want to talk to that at all.
It's all dependent on the impacts that are felt by the community. We can't say it's gonna take 3 hours, it's gonna take 4 hours based off of what Cat 2, Cat 1. It's all about those local impacts. So I wish I could look in that crystal ball and tell you it's gonna take 3 hours for your power to be restored, but we can't do that.
So I can speak a little bit to that because I've actually toured a lot of facilities with the county, and I do spend a lot of time with Florida Power and Light. And they have really improved their level of service.
I didn't see a lot of their facilities listed as exposure.
Right, my city's facilities are honestly ancient. So I've actually looked at the county's facilities, and I've toured these. And I'm not saying it's fun to go tour a wastewater treatment plant because it's horrific. But I can tell you that the level of service that I've seen from them and the preparedness that all of their staff has, from a high executive to the man that cleans the building, is remarkable. And I've seen the level of commitment of these employees during storms, like the snowstorm. I mean, my own city, yes, our city was shut down just like the county, but we still had staff that was going out constantly checking. Surprisingly, my city held up well, and I'm honestly shocked because, well, I have very antiquated services. But I think all of our county has, because of our history with storms, I do think they are stepping up, and they're trying to help more. It's not just at county level, it's more like private citizens, because honestly, it's the private citizens that support our county and pay the bills, essentially. So it does make a difference. But I know that, FPL is always staging now ahead of storms and being way more prepared than necessary sometimes. But I appreciate that access. And honestly, I'm shocked that we don't lose power as much, more often than, we lose very little. And the water and sewer, you don't really hear in our county about loss of water and sewer in our area too often, which is, I'm very thankful for. So.
Yeah, there's a lift station at the end of Tarpon as well. And it's great.
Yeah,
I'll
let's
add
talk
to
about
that a
stations.
little bit, Wayne. It's a
No, it's very good.
good question, reasonable question. You may have noticed in one of the previous slides how many lift stations were populating the map. And it's just the inherent nature of sewer. It all flows to the lowest point. And so we're not like power where we can build a substation up or anything like that. We have to go to the low spots to catch it. And Okaloosa County's water and sewer system has a very large number of lift stations. And we have been on a continuous effort to build monitoring for those so that we can see from a central location if they're starting to be flooded or inundated. We've built in a lot of systems that allow us to bypass the pump if we lose power. We've had a pretty good program to purchase on-site generators or portable generators. And so that's one thing that takes the time. If we have something big happen, the first thing we're going to do is go out and assess the situation, determine what the priorities are. In one particular event, your area may be priority one, so it's going to get faster. In some cases, it won't. And so it's very dependent upon what actually happens, like Ryan had said. And so we're a lot better than we were, I will say that, and we're continuing to improve. But it's just one of those things. Lift station of all of the utilities, probably one of the most vulnerable when you're talking about flooding, or you're talking about those type rain events.
I wanted to make sure everybody else spoke first. I like to speak last, but anybody else have any questions? I got a lot. Well, my name's Chris Kerb, and I basically work for an advocacy group that got established 4 years ago, founded and funded by the chairman of the Flood Coalition, American Flood Coalition. And I basically do local, I'll call it pushing. That's the easiest way to do it. Because I don't like the word lobbying or activist. I like advocates, because I'm trying to help things. But I had a few questions here. You made a comment about all these 100-year storm. Have you heard of First Street Foundation?
Yes.
Did y'all utilize their model? I think it was put out in 2023 for flooding. They basically did a model that set up a precip and floods act that Congress passed, where we're going to have new rainfall down. I know that was 15 in 2026. They did an awesome model to push that with Congress. I do local push, American Flood Coalition, does state and federal. have y'all looked through that? Has that been kind of, I'm sorry I missed the first few minutes.
You're right.
You may have already went over that, but, how you came up with these models, I'm pretty sure sea level rise was one of them. So what model did you use from a flooding perspective? Stormwater rainfall?
It's a great question. And so we typically try and use government-supported data. And so for that 1% 100-year flood event, we start with the FEMA 100-year flood model as a base. We recognize it's not perfect.
At all.
Yeah, we recognize it's not perfect. We know there's room for improvement. However, we use it because it is well aligned, right, with a lot of programs. You know, First Street, we know they have important information. We'll sometimes use it as a gut check, but we typically don't use, private information like that when it's where consultants as a professional responsibility, right? If someone comes and asks me, well, how did that get made? I can't give you quite as good of an answer as I could if we were, working directly with the partner. On this project, we worked with FSU Ryder. We developed a bathtub flood model for the region where we were able to evaluate what that 100-year flood plus sea level rise looks like. We're going to be passing this back and forth a whole bunch.
No, I only have a few things. Please don't take this the wrong way. But FEMA flood insurance rate maps do not reflect the reality of flooding. I worked 25 years in the Stanley County Engineering Department and been through multiple flood events. They don't even have some of their creeks mapped out. Santa Rosa County is similar. I really haven't dived deep into Okaloosa County. I'll put it to you in a different way. FEMA is part of the establishment. They don't think outside the box when it comes to flood insurance rate maps. And research will be pushed to them by the Precedent Act that Congress passed. There will be an interagency committee. All the alphabet soups of federal government that deal with water-related issues will be using the new rainfall data of 2026. Now, what does that got to do with Okaloosa County? Well, Okaloosa County gets a lot of grants. Matter of fact, I'm pretty sure this vulnerability assessment was paid for through an FDP resiliency grant. Oh, by the way, you're welcome. American Flood Coalition pushed that through the state of Florida. $100 million a year. And I think they've already put, what was it, 16 billion? I wrote it down somewhere here. Oh, here it is right here. 1.5 billion, that's what it was, in flooding and resilience projects today. So that's pretty cool. I love it when our legislation is doing good things that help out. So, have another question. Did y'all look at the Gap Creek Basin study that's on Okaloosa files?
I have to double check. I believe we did have that as one of our data sources.
Okay, yeah, HDR did that. Forget what year, but there's some major issues along that Gap Creek that were identified in that HDR study. Got a few flood defenders over there. I have flood defenders, not all of them are active. Thomas Jefferson said we have don't have a government by the majority. We have a government by the majority participant. All tyranny needs to take a foothold is for people to get conscious to remain silent. And it's we the people, not me the people. So I think that's all the questions I had. I know a lot of these folks are ready to go home. I'm staying at kind of out on the beach, so I had a cold beer in the refrigerator.
Thank you, Chris. We appreciate your participation. I'm happy to, if you're okay with staying on, I'm happy to talk to you more about some of the nuts and bolts, particularly related to the modeling, which may put other folks to sleep, especially this summer. Are there any other questions folks would like to go through before we talk about the next steps?
I was gonna get there too. I've seen this happen in other municipalities, they get the vulnerability assessment done and then it goes on the shelf. I've seen in other municipalities, they get a vulnerability assessment done and it goes on the shelf to collect dust. They don't revise their comprehensive plan or their land development code or zoning overlays for flood problem areas. I hope that doesn't happen here, but a lot of municipalities are still under their vulnerability assessment. I think y'all are working on 3 of them.
Honestly, I've lost count.
Y'all are doing pretty good.
That's a good point, right? And actually, I don't know if you mentioned, but you teed me up perfectly. So the vulnerability assessment, right? You can do with it however much you want. You can use it to just support a couple of pet projects for one department. You can use it to operationalize resilience throughout your county, update your comp plan, update your flood ordinance, right? Look at how you look at land use. It just, it's up to the county. In Escambia County and Okaloosa, we're going to try and do the most that we can. We're going to look at comp plans, right? We're going to look at, what projects can get in the LMS, right? What projects are already in the CIP for water and wastewater can we support? Can we elevate with the vulnerability assessment? So we're trying to make sure that within that Okaloosa County really does operationalize resilience so that we can address the widest range of issues possible.
Chris, maybe I can answer a question for you. This particular event, or this flood vulnerability assessment is to be part of our local mitigation strategy, which is in the process of being updated. So this is part of it. It is not only just for the county, it includes all 9 municipalities too.
I'll ask you. LMS is more reactive than proactive. Am I correct?
No, because those projects that are on that local mitigation strategy are out there so that they can be funded by any grant that comes around that they can apply for.
So you're reacting to flood damages versus being proactive from keeping it from happening on
Some-
new stuff, is what I'm saying.
Some of the newest, the flood ordinance was renewed here lately.
Oh, okay, I didn't know that.
Yes.
Okay. That's good.
And also, the flood maps were redistributed and new ones were submitted to us and adopted in '21. So
Yes.
ours are one of the last ones to have paper maps, so we are now all digital. And they are in the process of redoing and restudying the area for flood maps.
Cool. Good information there. Escambia County still hasn't adopted their 2018. I don't know about that. They're working on it. Y'all hear that a lot in government, don't you? I worked 25 years there. That was a very good response. We're working on it.
I have a question for you.
Yes,
So, would Jacobs recommend that the county and all the municipalities adopt a similar ordinance as far as seawall heights and?
That's a really good question. And I'm going to give the consultant answer, which everybody hates. It depends. It depends on what you're talking about. But for seawall heights, you want to be consistent. Because like we said, right, you don't want to flood your neighbor. If, your seawall is 5 feet and I have a living shoreline, that doesn't really work. And so that would be something where we do recommend that we're consistent, right, across
Well, a lot of
areas.
these shorelines, we all border each other, so that's why
And
I think it needs to be more of a countywide
Yes.
thing, because if this city only has a 4 foot and the next,
Yes. And so for seawalls, we would recommend, right, within the county that everybody be consistent. I believe, I'm gonna remember this correctly, it was either Broward County or Palm Beach who has a seawall elevation of 5 feet, that's their ordinance. I think it's Broward. And so it'd be something similar here, we typically see those ordinances range from 4 to 6 feet. And so as we go through the adaptation process, we'll talk about that. And part of the adaptation process as well is really bringing everybody together to talk about these things. Because it doesn't do us any good if we just write a report and say, okay, have your seawall ordinance be 5 feet. We have to get everybody in the room and sit and figure out how it's gonna work. But in terms of, to get back to your original question, it would be beneficial to have a consistent ordinance across municipalities.
Thank you.
One of the things that I did want to mention is that a lot of this great work that's going on in the county and around the region, it's really important, April, what you just said with the kind of building consistency across different ordinances and whatnot. But one thing that I did want to plug is that something that came out of the Emerald Coast MIR is that the Emerald Coast Regional Council has created that resilience collaborative, and I think that that's a good space to plug into for each county and municipality to then see what's going on with their neighbors, and then also to help elevate and push projects forward. So not just from the MIR, but also from the vulnerability assessments too, because I think the more plans that we can identify these mitigation strategies in, the more likely they are to then be funded. And so, I mean, as a region, we're just trying to work together for that, and I know the Regional Council is also working on MOUs for resiliency across the region. And so just wanted to plug that, because that's a good opportunity for different agencies to get plugged in, even if they weren't at the beginning of the military installation resilience review. They can
We're
start to
heavily
plug
involved.
in. Yes, and I know that Mary Esther is, and so yeah. But I just want to throw that out there for anybody watching online.
I have one more question.
Sure thing, Liz.
So floodplain managers, technically, are the only ones that are supposed to be able to pull historical flood data specific to addresses. That's something to do with a Federal Privacy Act. Were y'all able to access any of that data?
We did not look at that.
No.
Oh, Danny's got that.
Yeah, no, I think Sherry did share that data with us to the best that she could. Obviously not showing with individual addresses, but yeah, we've been working with Sherry kind of, step by step throughout this entire process, pulling those sorts of data.
Yeah, there's ways to share, but you don't share the addresses.
Yes, absolutely. So we've provided those sorts of things.
Just for informational purposes, something called floodsmarts.gov historical data. Since 1968, when the flood insurance program, National Flood Insurance Program, was initiated, we've had in Okaloosa County 5,576 claims paid for $280,741,974. Now, how much of that is actual debt? Because we pay a lot of interest. I think we paid $6.1 billion just in interest for what they borrowed to cover insurance premium. Flood insurance premiums doesn't cover all these flood damages. So, point being is this is a serious issue. A lot of people don't know those numbers. That's our tax dollars.
Thank you for sharing that, Chris. I do want to be conscientious of the time. It is almost 6:35. So we would like to thank everybody for taking the time out of their day to attend. Our information is here. If you have questions, if you'd like to follow up, we'll also be hanging around a couple of minutes afterward if you have any follow-up questions as well. Our next steps are going to be, we're going to finalize our report. We'll be submitting that to the county for submission to FDEP. Like we had talked about earlier, we'll begin that application process. So this is not the last you'll hear from us, and you will see us again. We're going to start talking about how we mitigate and adapt for these flooding issues. So thank you all for taking the time and attending. Thanks to those who are watching today. Good night.
Always good to see you. Seriously.
Turned off.
Okay.